The Garden of Gethsemane, a sermon delivered by Dr. Rob Blackburn on February 24, 2013 at Central United Methodist Church in Asheville, North Carolina.
Our scripture lesson today comes from the Gospel according to Mark, the 14th chapter, verses 32 through 42. Hear this, the word of God. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took with him Peter and James and John and began to be distressed and agitated. And he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake." And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want." He came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into a time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And once more he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy, and they did not know what to say to him. He came a third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up. Let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
"24 hours, the last day of Jesus' life. Remember where we were last week? We were in the first hours of that day. We were in a room we call the upper room. It's the Seder feast. The bread was broken, and Jesus said, "No one's taking my life." He says, I give this for you. And he said, do this, not just the ritual, but his whole way of life. And the serving, the giving, he said, do this now in remembrance of me. And now we're going to move into those next set of hours, and we're going to be leaving that room that's stuffy with the aroma of lamb and bitter herbs, and we're going to be moving out into the cool of the evening and the open air. And where are we headed? We're headed across the Kidron Valley, okay? We're going to go outside the city walls and the city limits and over toward a place called the Mount of Olives. One of the Gospels called it a garden. Two of the Gospels called it Gethsemane, put it all together, and it was probably a garden. In the Mount of Olives area, it was called Gethsemane. We were told that he went there as was his custom. Was it the prayer life? Probably. Was it maybe this is where they went every night while they were in Jerusalem? Why? Well, the place was crowded. No room in the inns, the hostels. Jerusalem at Passover would be like New Orleans this year at the Super Bowl. And maybe it was about safety. You know, during the day, Jesus was surrounded by friends and followers from Galilee. It was hard for his adversaries to get to him, but now in the evening, he was more at risk, so what do? You get out of town, go beyond the city limits to a quieter, safer place, the Mount of Olives. It's the custom of tourists and visitors to go there. There is a site that's named as possibly the place of the Garden of Gethsemane. Probably not the exact place, probably near. There's a church there. It's called the Church of All Nations. And when you walk in, it's a rather darkened sanctuary, and there are stars up on the ceiling. There's an iron railing in the middle of the sanctuary, and that's encircling a rather large outcropping. And pilgrims can go and kneel there and reach out their hands and touch the rock upon which he supposedly knelt. It's a moving place. I was there with some friends from Asheville, a lot of them from Central, 12 years or so ago, and we were staying at a hotel on the top end of Mount of Olives, and it was dusk, and our itinerary was finished for the day, so I walked back down to that site called the Garden of Gethsemane. All the tourist buses were gone, and I walked back to the end of the confinement, and there was just a little wall there, and something made me want to go across the wall because I saw something. I saw folks that were actually harvesting olives, and this is what they were doing. They were using long sticks and knocking the branches and sheets on the ground, and the olives falling into the sheets and wrapping them up, and it was a fascinating thing to watch. And they were finishing up their work. It was about dusk, and they left, and I was there all by myself. It was the cool of the evening, dusk. I was standing there amidst these ancient olive trees, gnarled and knotted, these old roots clambering across the rocky soil, and the half moon cast the whole grove in silver. It got very quiet. There was just a gentle breeze. You could hear nothing but the rustling of the leaves. And I tried to picture what it must have been like that night, the sights and sounds. And it had to be springtime, but yeah, it had to be because that was Passover time, and probably the air was filled with the fragrance of blossoms. And I tried to hear the footsteps, think about what that would have been like. This time it's not going to be the footsteps of one man. That's usually the way it was when Jesus went to pray. All through the scriptures it says he went aside, he went up onto the hills, and he was always by himself. And the disciples had to go looking for him. Jesus, where have you been? But this time, no, he takes his whole band of followers. It would have been the clump of a band of footsteps. By instincts, we know, don't we, that sometimes you really do need to be in the company of others. Those moments right before maybe surgery, when you're drawing your last breaths, great anniversaries and celebrations, you want people there with you. Jesus apparently wanted the disciples to come. He didn't ask any of them to do any locker room speeches or offer any words of encouragement, but he wanted them there. Solitary confinement is probably the worst punishment that our species has ever come up with. But tonight's not going to be solitary for Jesus. He didn't want it that way. He invited his friends to come. Do you think maybe in those moments Jesus was experiencing loneliness? Loneliness he had never before encountered. You say, well, yeah, but the disciples, they were with him. They let him down. Yeah, they did go to sleep. Jesus, a little disappointed, yes. He spoke of it. Understanding, yes. He says he knew how it was. Sometimes, the heart is willing, but the body just can't keep up with the heart. And he knew they had just spent, we talked about it last week, a 5-hour meal together, all the food and the wine. Do you think some of us wouldn't have dozed off? Don't be too hard on the disciples. Mark says Jesus got to the garden with his friends, and then he went a little farther. So here we have Jesus on the ground in the grove, imploring and praying. Last week, I noted that the traditional picture that we have framed in our mind of the Last Supper was Da Vinci's picture. And that's the picture we all have in our mind. And we said we have to do a little work on that picture. Well, we have a picture in our mind of Jesus in Gethsemane. Every Methodist church that I grew up in, that I ever served, has this picture. It's in 2 of our Sunday school classes. I saw them this week. It's a rather beautiful picture, but this is how Jesus is pictured. He's kneeling before a large rock outcropping. His face is turned up. A lot of light is cast on his face. His hands are neatly folded, and his face is one of serenity and peace. This is not Mark's picture of Gethsemane. Here's Mark's picture. Jesus is the one whose garments soaked in sweat. The hair is matted against his forehead. I don't think Jesus is gently kneeling. The picture I get in Mark is he's lying on the ground, his face in the dirt, and his hands, his fingers are clawing at the rocky soil. This is what Mark says. He was in deep distress and the greatest of anguish. Jesus' face was as twisted as the olive trees that surrounded him. So friends, here in Lent, what are we going to do with that image, picture of Jesus? I'm going to suggest we learn from it. We let it take us to a place where we think about what we do when our soul gets deeply distressed. Here's Jesus, lonely. Lonelier than probably he'd ever been. He's weary. Listen to his weariness before he even got there. It was before the table in the Lord's Supper. He had been talking about pouring out his life, and here the disciples are arguing about who's going to get the best seat at the table. Don't you think Jesus just got tired of that? He just kept pouring out his best truth, and people sometimes just weren't getting it. Of course he was tired. But in the garden, most of all, he was afraid. Does that bother you for me to tell you that Jesus was afraid? Of course he was afraid. Man, the pain and the suffering, the possibility of humiliating death, Jesus could already feel the noose tightening about his neck. His adversaries were drawing closer. He knew that something was around the corner that would be filled with just pain and humiliation. He didn't relish that any more than you and I would. This isn't Jesus being anxious. This is Jesus being afraid. What do they say? Fear is worry's big brother. If worry is a burlap sack, fear is a trunk of concrete. And it just won't budge. You ever had fear get stuck here and it just won't budge? And that's Jesus in the garden. In the Gospel of Luke, we're told that he sweated blood. The Greek word is thrombosis. He sweated great clots of blood. And what are we going to do with this picture? Look what Jesus did with his weariness, his fear. What does he do with it? He told somebody about it. Why else would we have the details of this narrative? He told somebody about it. It's as he's telling us. We don't do that. We like to cover that up. We like to keep our sweaty palms in our pocket. We like to keep our dry mouth a secret. But here's Jesus. He's not wearing the mask of strength. He's telling us about it. And most importantly, he's telling his Father. I wonder sometimes if we are debilitated by our weariness and by our fear and by our loneliness. Because we have this nervousness in the presence of God. We think, well, there's just certain things you shouldn't say, and we shouldn't say it that way. No. You know what this story of Gethsemane tells me? He says, talk to the boss, make an appointment with God. And just tell God exactly how it is. Your relationship with God's strong enough to handle that. I mean, Jesus did. Moses did. Remember Moses? He's out there in the Sinai Peninsula, been wandering around for several years, and he said, God, just thank you. We did have a really nice big exodus, and that was wonderful, but we've been out here, and the food is not that great, and the water is just awfully hard to find. And some of us have been talking, and it just feels like you've left us on our own. I just thought I would bring that to your attention. God's strong enough in your relationship to handle that. Don't tiptoe around your Gethsemanes, this story tells us. Go on into the garden, fall to your knees, and pounding the ground is permitted, and tears are allowed. And if you sweat drops of blood, know that you're not the first one to sweat them. Just do as Jesus did. Open your heart and be specific. He said, this cup, tonight, he said, it's too heavy. Could it pass from me? Just be specific. God, your relationship with God is large enough to handle that. This is the God of all compassion. Make an appointment with God. So what are we going to do with this image? I think we're going to let it carry us into the depths of honest prayer. And could we let it carry us into the breadths of experiencing the full humanity of Jesus? Here's the question we need to ask during Lent. How human is your Jesus? How human? There was this exhibit going around the major museums in the United States. This is about 15 years ago, called Robots and Beyond. It was rather interesting. And the key figure was this mannequin they had in the center of the room that had this skin that looked so lifelike. It was really this piezoelectric kind of film that it could, just a little bit of pressure, it could transmit electric impulses that would trigger verbal response from the mannequin. It was kind of impressive. People would walk up, and if you touched the chest rather lightly, you would get maybe a languid response. It would be like the mannequin would say, "Ooh, I can feel that." But if you came up and gave some kind of tough, rapid thrust of your finger, the mannequin would say, "Ooh, stop that. Who do you think you are, a woodpecker?" And so people were having kind of fun with this. It was kind of fascinating, but everybody knew at the end of the day, the mannequin's not really feeling anything. It doesn't have an ounce of blood in it. This is all wires and currents and impulses and computerized voices. No matter what he said, there's no comprehension of joy or pain. I think sometimes we have failed the fullness of what Jesus can mean to us because we've turned him into this kind of wind-up spiritual automaton, this Lord who looks human and sounds human. Oh, we're not going to go too far in that. No real pain. Couldn't be. No real suffering. Why do we do that? I don't know. Maybe it's a misconstrued sense of somehow this is the only way we can be reverent about him. I know this. I know the historic creed, the Apostles' Creed, it just will not let us do that. I mean, it's so graphic about the details of his human existence. We say it here so often on Sundays. He was conceived, born, suffered, died, buried. That's pretty human, isn't it? I mean, his story is our story. For 33 years, he felt everything we have ever felt. He got weak. He grew weary. He got his feelings hurt. He was afraid of failure. He got viruses. He got cold. His feet got tired and his head ached. Listen to him when he said, "Love your neighbor." This came from someone whose neighbors would eventually kill him. This is God with us. This is the eternal Son wrapped up in human skin fully, not partially, not nearly, entirely. No exceptions, no substitutes. We see it every year during election time. Oh, you know how the politicians like to go about here and there and try to strike a lick to impress folks. And you'll see a politician walk into a factory and throw on some overalls and put on a hard hat. "Look at me, I'm one of the workers." And he's sitting there fiddling with the assembly line, working there for about an hour or so. The workers are not impressed. Why? Because they know he'll leave when the cameras leave. It's just partial. He's just dabbling in it. This isn't what we have in Jesus. Look at Jesus in Gethsemane. The loneliness, the weariness, the fear, Jesus clawing the ground. And the book of Hebrews says we don't have a superhuman high priest. We have one, a Lord who has experienced fully all that we experience. I don't know. Maybe it would seem safer to have a Lord who never had calluses, but I think that's a little cold. You know, maybe Jesus could have walked away from the fully human thing, at least from the suffering part. I mean, he wasn't powerless there in Gethsemane. He could have gotten out and slipped out of town and gone back to Galilee, and he could have written a few books and gone on a speaking tour and gotten married and had a family and retired. But if he had, do you think we would have ever sung "What a Friend We Have in Jesus"? There's power to know that from the funeral to the factory to the frustration, the demanding schedule, he's been there. He's felt all that we have felt, and more than that, that means he's in there with us. He's in the mire, he's in the muck. He hurts where we hurt. He comes weeping and wailing alongside of us. There's power in that. That's what I think we do with this picture of Jesus in Gethsemane. Oh, by the way, there's another problem some people have with this picture, though. They say, you know, I'm a little bothered by the fact that, well, when we're back in the upper room, there seemed to be this sense of just warmth that Jesus had about what he was about and what he was doing. The air was just seemed to be filled with that kind of emotional response. But now in this place, it just seems like, well, Jesus' heart isn't quite in it, and that bothers some people. But if that's our problem, maybe our problem is that we want all religion and spiritual life to be perpetually just this smiling heart and a heart aflutter. Come on, folks. I mean, suppose getting out of bed in the morning and cleaning the carpet and studying for an exam waited on your heart being aflutter, huh? I mean, the world would come to a halt, wouldn't it? Oh, Corey wanted to play the preludes today, but when he got to church and saw it, it just wasn't his favorite, and his heart just hit. He'll maybe be here next week when he can get into it. Come on, you know. Think about the saving, redeeming love that Jesus is playing out in the world, and how many times that would have grinded to a halt if it had just been at the moments that it was pleasing. Come on. What did Fred Craddock used to say? Here the church stands before the world with the green light, but the traffic is backed up all the way to Alaska because the church is sitting around tinkering with its feelings. Look, Jesus had more muscle to his kind of love than that. I mean, it didn't get held up and halted by how he happened to feel about it at the moment. No, he was guided and moved by a holy must, a true necessity. And where did he keep finding that? The story suggests in prayer. He goes in prayer, and it's an honest prayer. Oh, yes, he pours out his feelings and emotions, all of them. His relationship with the Father is strong enough for that. He goes into that garden of gnarled trees and rocky soils, and he claws at the ground, and he says, this cup just seems so heavy tonight. Could it just be done some other way? Could it pass from me? Does Jesus get an answer? Some would say, well, maybe, I'm not sure. I think he did. I think what Jesus got is the answer that you and I really most seek when we pray, and that's communion with God. And how do I know that happened? Just listen to how the prayer shifts. Jesus goes from, could this cup pass, to, I didn't come here, he said, just to do what's pleasing at the moment. He said, my life is a part of something larger than that. It's the will and the way and the love of my Father. He remembers that. He remembers that his feet have been on that path, that he's been a partner with God and playing out that love in the world. And he remembered the world's need for such redeeming and reconciling love. He remembered you and me. And then, you see, he sees the cup not as a detour on the way to the kingdom, but he sees it as thy kingdom come. So Jesus prays for hours in anguish, and then you see him unclenching his fist. He moves beyond the anguish, and he gets to his feet, and he comes to the disciples with a sense of resoluteness, doesn't he? He says, come on now, get up. We're going to move on toward the ones who intend to take my life. You see what's happening? His will has converged with his Father's will. I know I've said this in sermons before. It's been said many times that the battle was won at Golgotha. I'm beginning to shift my thinking a little bit on that. I think maybe the battle was won there on the ground in Gethsemane. And that the sign of the victory was a final peace in Jesus' heart and the olive trees. It's in Gethsemane that he made his decision. I have shared this story with you before. It comes out of world history. King Cyrus, of Persia, he was the big guy, not just on the block, but the whole Mediterranean world, and his empire was vast. he loved to throw his weight around, heavy taxation, pushing peoples and population groups about. But up in one of his northern provinces, there was his local chieftain. He was just kind of a rebel heart and mind. His name was Cagular, and he would buck against the rules and against the taxation, and they never could just find him or locate him or bring him under control. And finally, Cyrus said to his head general, he said, we're going to take the entire Persian army up there and do not come home until you find him. So after 2 years of hunting and searching, they finally got Cagular. They've captured him, and they have him in chains as well as his wife and his children. Now they're being led back to the city, and there they are hauled before the court of King Cyrus. And here is the scene. Cyrus is up perched on his throne, and Cagular and his family in chains below them. And King Cyrus looks down at Cagular and says, Cagular, what would you to say if I were to spare your life on this day? And Cagular shook his chains and saying, well, seeing these, he said, if you were to spare my life, King, I would say that I would spend the rest of my days serving you. And then the king said, well, Cagular, what would you to say if I were to spare the life of your children, your wife? And Cagular said, oh, King Cyrus, if you were to do that, I would die for that. Well, King Cyrus is an interesting fellow, and he was so moved by the moxie and bravado of Cagular that he says, you're just exactly the kind of guy we need to run the northern provinces, and I am now going to name you governor of the northern provinces. Just like that, Cagular and his family is freed, and now they're on their way home, and Cagular is just shaking his head about the whole experience, and he turns to his wife and he said, wasn't it amazing, all the things we saw there? Did you see those marble courtyards? They stretched out for acres of marble courtyards. And she said, no, I don't think I really noticed them. He said, oh, I'm sure when we were there in the king's room, you noticed his throne. That was several tons of solid gold and mahogany trim. Did you notice that? She said, no, I didn't really notice the throne. He said, well, you were there. What did you see? She said, well, to tell you the truth, the only thing I could see was the face of a man who said he would die for me. So here we are, friends. Do you know we have just a few hours left till Jesus will be dead? He'll be dead by this afternoon. Okay. There's going to be a lot of things for us to see in the upcoming hours. There will be courtyards and mob scenes and crowds and Roman gibbets. And I'm going to suggest today, though, that we focus our eyes just on one thing. On the face of a man who prayed in deep anguish and fear. But at the end of the day, he lifted the cup and looked into his face, the one who said he would die for us.